The auditorium was huge, much bigger than anything a small child should ever have to walk into. The air inside felt heavy and thick, not just because there were hundreds of people packed into the seats, but because of the tension. You could practically feel it sitting on your skin. This wasn't a school play where parents clap politely no matter what happens. This was a serious competition, the kind where people spend years training, spend all their savings on lessons, and travel for miles just for a chance to be seen. The stage lights were so bright that they hurt your eyes if you looked at them for too long, and they made the back of the room disappear into a dark, scary nothingness. In the waiting area backstage, it was even worse. It was a maze of wires, instruments, and people rushing around. Everywhere you looked, there were adults getting ready. There were women in long, sparkling dresses adjusting their hair in the mirrors, looking nervous but focused. There were men in suits loosening their ties, wiping sweat from their foreheads, and humming quietly to keep their voices warm. These were the contenders. They were tall, confident, and looked like they belonged on a poster. They were professionals, or at least people who took their art very seriously. They looked at each other with a mix of respect and rivalry, sizing up the competition, and then there was him, standing in the corner. Almost hidden behind a stack of amplifier cases was a little boy. He was only 6 years old. In a room full of giants, he looked like a tiny doll that had been misplaced. He was wearing a suit, but it was clearly too big for him. The jacket sleeves were a little too long, covering his wrists, and his pants were bunching up slightly over his shiny black shoes. He looked like he was playing dress-up in his dad's clothes, but the look on his face was very serious. He wasn't playing. He was terrified. The boy's mother and father stood close by, like protective shields. His mother kept smoothing down his hair, even though it wasn't messy. It was just something to do with her hands to stop them from shaking. His father had his hands deep in his pockets, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. They looked at the other competitors, the tall, polished teenagers and adults, and then they looked down at their son. You could see the worry in their eyes. They knew how good their son was. At least they hoped they did. They had heard him practicing in their living room 1,000 times. But seeing him here in this massive, intimidating place made everything feel different. It felt real now. It felt scary. Backstage, the atmosphere was cold. Some of the older competitors were stretching their fingers or tuning their guitars. A few of them glanced over at the small boy in the corner. When they looked at him, they didn't see a rival. They didn't see a threat. They saw a cute kid. They saw a filler act, someone the judges put on the show to be adorable for a minute, so the audience could relax before the next serious performance. They smiled, but it was that kind of smile you give a puppy. It was sweet, but it didn't command respect. One of the older teenagers, a girl with a very fancy dress, even whispered to her friend, pointing at him. They both giggled softly. They thought he was going to go out there, maybe plunk out "Mary Had a Little Lamb." Everyone would say, "Ah," and that would be it. The little boy didn't say anything. He just stood there, clutching a small piece of paper with his number on it. His knuckles were white because he was holding it so tight. He could hear the noise from the audience outside. Every time someone laughed or clapped, his shoulders jumped a little. He knew what people thought when they saw him. He knew they saw a baby. He knew they didn't expect much. And that was the hardest part. It wasn't just the fear of playing the piano. It was the fear of being misunderstood. He had spent months, maybe even his whole short life, preparing for this moment while other kids were playing outside with balls and video games. He had given up his playtime to sit at a keyboard finally. A man with a headset and a clipboard walked through the curtains. He looked tired and stressed. He shouted out a few names, pointing people toward the curtain. Then he stopped in front of the small family. He looked down at his list, then at the boy. He raised an eyebrow, looking a bit surprised. "Okay, little guy, you're up," the stage manager said. His voice wasn't mean, but it was in a hurry. "Good luck out there." The mother bent down. She fixed the boy's collar one last time. She looked him right in the eyes. "Remember what we practiced?" She whispered, "Just play your heart out. Don't look at them. Just look at the keys." The boy nodded. He didn't trust his voice to speak. He was afraid if he opened his mouth, He might cry. He felt a lump in his throat that was as big as a tennis ball. His father reached out and squeezed his shoulder. He didn't say anything, but the squeeze said everything. "I'm here. I'm proud of you no matter what." The boy took a deep breath. He had to walk through the heavy black curtains alone. His parents couldn't go with him. As he stepped toward the opening, the noise from the audience got louder. It was a low rumble, like the sound of the ocean, but with thousands of human voices mixed in. He stepped through the curtains and out onto the stage. The moment he stepped out, the lights hit him. They were blinding. He couldn't see the audience at all. It was just a wall of bright white light and a vague sense of a huge dark space in front of him. The floor of the stage felt slippery and vast. To get to the piano, he had to walk what felt like a mile. It was a long, lonely walk across a wooden platform that seemed to go on forever. Out in the audience, people were settling back into their seats. They had just watched a very intense performance by a young man who played the violin. The judges had given him a hard time critiquing his technique. The crowd was buzzing with opinions. When they saw the small figure walk out onto the stage, a quiet ripple went through the room. It was that sound of surprise. People leaned forward to see better. "Is that a child?" Someone whispered a few rows back. "Where are his parents?" Someone else asked. "Looks like he's wearing his dad's suit." A voice giggled nearby. The host of the show walked out to meet him in the middle of the stage. The host was tall and loud, wearing a bright suit that sparkled under the lights. He looked down at the boy and smiled his big TV smile. He held the microphone out to the boy, but the boy was too shy to speak properly. The host laughed, a booming sound that echoed through the hall. "Well, look at this," the host cheered. "We have a very special guest tonight. How old are you, sir?" "6," the boy whispered into the mic, his voice sounding small and fragile compared to the host's booming voice. 6 years old? The host shouted to the crowd. "And what are you going to do for us today?" "Play the piano," the boy said, barely audible. The audience clapped politely. It was nice to see you clap. It wasn't the clap you give someone you expect to win. It was the clap you give a toddler who just learned to walk. They thought this was a break. They thought they could relax, maybe cough, check their phones, or whisper to their neighbor while the cute kid played a simple song. The boy walked over to the piano. It was a massive grand piano, shiny and black. It looked like a sleeping beast. It was bigger than his entire kitchen table at home. He reached the bench and stopped. The audience watched. Now came the awkward part. The bench was set for an adult. When the boy tried to sit on it, his feet dangled high above the floor, swinging uselessly. He looked ridiculous. He looked like a toddler sitting on a bar stool. A few people laughed gently. It wasn't mean laughter, but it was laughter born of amusement at how small he looked compared to the instrument. The boy realized he couldn't reach the pedals. He knew this might happen. He didn't panic, though he felt his face get hot. He reached down with both hands, grabbing the sides of the heavy leather bench. He grunted softly with the effort, lifting himself up enough to drag the bench closer to the keys. It was a struggle. The squeak of the bench moving across the wooden floor was loud in the microphone. He finally got it close enough. He sat up straight. He smoothed down his jacket, trying to look dignified even though his feet were dangling. He looked tiny, perched there in front of that enormous wall of black and white keys. The judges were sitting at a long table to the side. One judge, an older man with gray hair and glasses, was looking at his watch. He looked bored. He tapped his pen on the table, a rhythmic, impatient sound. Another judge, a woman with a very stern face, was writing something on a piece of paper, probably already making notes about his posture or his outfit. They had seen it all before. They expected a cute, sloppy performance. They were ready to say, "Good job, kid," and move on. The boy placed his hands on his knees. He took a second to close his eyes. He blocked out the host, the judges, the thousands of people, and the blinding lights. He thought about the music. He thought about why he was there. He wasn't there to be cute. He wasn't there to make people laugh at his dangling feet. He was there to play. He opened his eyes and placed his small, delicate hands on the keys. They were so small that he couldn't stretch an octave easily, but he knew how to work around it. He took a deep breath, filling his small lungs with the dusty air of the stage. He was shaking, but just a little. He felt like a bird sitting on a wire before a storm. The room went quiet. A silence fell over the crowd, the kind of silence where you could hear a pin drop. The silence that filled the auditorium was not the peaceful kind. It was an awkward, waiting silence, the kind that happens when people are trying to be polite but are really just waiting for something to happen so they can go back to their normal lives. The little boy sat perched on the piano bench, his legs dangling several inches above the floor. From the back of the room, he looked like a puppet that had been left behind. The shiny black piano was enormous, a beast of an instrument that seemed to swallow him up. The sheer size of the contrast was almost comical. In a different setting, people might have laughed at the sight. A small child in a baggy suit sitting before a concert grand piano, but here, under the harsh spotlight, it just felt lonely out in the crowd. People were shifting in their seats. A woman in the 5th row leaned over to her husband and whispered behind her hand. "He looks so scared," she said softly. "Do you think he even knows where to put his hands?" The husband nodded, his eyes already drifting down to the program in his lap to see who was coming up next. He wasn't interested in watching a child struggle to reach the pedals. It was painful to watch, in a way. Most people in the audience felt a mix of pity and mild amusement. They had paid for tickets to see a competition, to see talent and fire. Not to watch a kindergartner play a tentative, disjointed song. They were ready to offer a polite, sympathetic round of applause when he finished, just to make him feel good about being brave enough to come up there at the judges' table. The mood was even more skeptical. The judges were seasoned professionals. They had seen thousands of performers. They knew the difference between a prodigy and a kid whose parents had pushed them onto the stage. The judge in the middle, a man with silver hair and a sharp nose, glanced at his watch. It was late in the day, and he was tired. He tapped his gold pen against the desk, a rhythmic, annoying click that echoed slightly in the quiet hall. He was already mentally writing the critique in his head. He was thinking about how to say cute and needs practice without being too harsh. He wasn't looking for talent. He was looking for his coffee break. The female judge next to him was flipping through her papers, looking bored, barely lifting her eyes to glance at the small boy waiting to begin. The boy seemed to sense this. He felt the weight of their expectation like a heavy coat. He knew they were underestimating him. He could feel it in the way the air in the room felt stale and bored. He sat still for a moment, his back to the audience, staring at the black and white keys. They were familiar friends, but today they looked different. Under the bright lights, the white keys looked like jagged teeth, and the black keys like deep shadows. He took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling visibly inside his oversized jacket. He had to adjust his position. He scooted forward just an inch, trying to get a better angle. The bench squeaked, a loud, high-pitched sound that screeched through the microphone. A few people in the front row giggled nervously at the noise. The boy didn't turn around. He didn't blush. He simply lifted his hands and hovered them over the keys. His hands were incredibly small. His fingers were chubby and short, the kind of hands that usually hold crayons or toy cars. It seemed impossible that hands so tiny could master an instrument built for adults with long, spider-like fingers. The audience watched those small hands hovering. They were waiting for the clumsy mistake. They were waiting for the wrong note that would confirm that this was just a kid's game. Then, something changed in the boy's posture. The nervous slump in his shoulders vanished. He straightened his spine. He stopped being a 6-year-old boy in a baggy suit and became something else entirely. He became a musician. The atmosphere on the stage shifted. The air seemed to crackle with a sudden static energy. The boy stopped seeing the audience. He didn't see the bored judges or the cynical critics. He didn't see the dark, empty hall beyond the lights. His world shrank down to exactly the space between his hands and the piano keys. He closed his eyes for a brief second, blocking out the glare of the spotlights, and listened to the music in his head. It was loud, fast, and complicated. It was a song that demanded respect, and then his hands dropped. The first note wasn't a soft plink. It was a strike. He hit the keys with a force that seemed to come from his entire body. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a nursery rhyme. It was a thunderous, complex chord that vibrated through the floorboards and shook the dust from the rafters. It was a sound that belonged in a grand concert hall, played by a master, not on a talent show stage, played by a first grader. The sound was so sudden, so loud, and so sharp that several people in the audience physically jumped in their seats. It was like a gunshot in a library. The judge with the silver hair froze. His hand stopped tapping the pen. His head snapped up, his eyes wide behind his glasses. The suddenness and the aggression of the note shocked him. He wasn't the only one. The whispering in the audience died instantly. It was as if someone had reached into the room and pulled the plug on the conversation. Every head turned toward the stage. Every pair of eyes locked onto the small boy at the piano. He didn't stop. He didn't pause to see if they were listening. He launched into the piece immediately. His right hand began to move across the high keys with a speed that was frightening. It was a blur of motion. The notes cascaded down like rain, crisp and clear and impossibly fast. There was no hesitation. There was no searching for the right note. He knew exactly where every single key was. He was playing a melody that was intricate and beautiful, full of twists and turns that a child shouldn't be able to understand, let alone memorize. The contrast was mesmerizing. The visual of the boy was at war with the audio. He looked so small, so fragile, yet the music coming from the piano was huge, powerful, and commanding. It was like watching a mouse roar like a lion. The audience stared, their mouths slightly open. The woman in the fifth row forgot to look at her program. Her husband forgot about his coffee. They were both transfixed. They weren't just listening to the music. They were trying to figure out how this was even happening. They were looking for the trick. Was the piano playing itself? Was it a recording? But no, they could see his hands. They could see his fingers flying across the ivory, stretching and moving with a precision that was surgical. The boy's face was transformed. Gone was the terrified child from the wings. His brow was furrowed in deep, intense concentration. His jaw was set tight. He looked fierce. He was attacking the piano, pushing the tempo faster and faster. The music was driving and rhythmic, demanding attention. It had a heartbeat to it, a pulse that grabbed the room and forced everyone to listen. Even the judges were now leaning forward in their chairs. The bored lady judge had dropped her papers completely. She was staring at the boy's hands, her expression a mix of disbelief and awe. The silver-haired judge had taken his glasses off and was rubbing his eyes, as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. He had seen talented children before, but this was different. Most talented children play like robots. They have the technique, but they lack the soul. This boy played with emotion. He put weight behind the notes. He made the piano sing. He made it cry. He wasn't just hitting the right buttons. He was telling a story. The piece he was playing was physically demanding. It required a lot of jumps, where the hand has to move quickly from one end of the keyboard to the other. For a small child with small hands, this was incredibly difficult. But he executed the jumps perfectly. He landed on every note with absolute accuracy, never missing a beat. He would lean his whole body to the left to hit the low bass notes, throwing his weight into the sound, and then snap back to the right for the high, twinkling treble notes. The effort made him sway back and forth on the bench, looking like a small boat bobbing in a storm. But he never lost his balance. He never lost the rhythm. The sound filled the entire hall. It bounced off the walls and the ceiling. It swirled around the chandeliers and settled into the corners. The acoustics of the building, usually indifferent to the performers, seemed to embrace the music, carrying it to every ear in the room. The quality of the tone was surprising. It wasn't just loud. It was rich and warm. He had a soft touch when he needed it, caressing the keys gently during the quieter parts, before exploding back into the loud, rapid-fire passages. The dynamic range he displayed was incredible. One moment it was a whisper, the next it was a shout. In the center of it all was the 6-year-old boy lost in his own world. He didn't know that the audience was stunned. He didn't know that judges had put down their pens. He didn't know that people in the back rows were standing up to get a better look. He only knew the music. He could feel it running through his veins. For a few minutes, he wasn't the small kid who didn't fit in. He was a giant. He was the master of the stage. The piano was his voice, and he had a lot to say. The initial shock of the first note had passed, but the amazement was just settling in. The realization was washing over the crowd, one person at a time. They were witnessing something extraordinary. They were watching a miracle in the making. The silence that had once been bored and awkward was now heavy with awe. No one dared to breathe, afraid that even the sound of their own breath might break the spell and stop the magic. The music that flowed from the piano didn't just sound good. It sounded important. It had a weight to it, a seriousness that grabbed hold of everyone in the room and refused to let go. Usually, when a child plays an instrument, even if they are talented, there is a sense of cuteness. You hear the effort. You hear the slight hesitation. But this was different. This sounded like a master at work. The melody was complex and weaving, full of little twists and turns that seemed to tell a story without using any words. It wasn't just a bunch of notes strung together. It was a conversation. The boy's right hand was dancing over the high keys, playing a tune that was bright and fast, like sunlight sparkling on water, while his left hand was down in the lower end, playing a deep, steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The contrast was shocking to watch. The boy was so small that his hand could barely cover more than 5 or 6 white keys at once. To play some of the chords, he had to move his hand incredibly fast, snapping his wrist back and forth to hit the notes in the right sequence. It looked like his hand was vibrating. Most adults would struggle to play with that kind of speed and precision, but he did it without breaking a sweat. His face was calm but intense. His lips were pressed together in a tight line, and his eyes were locked on the keyboard as if his life depended on it. He wasn't looking at the audience. He wasn't looking at the judges. He had entered a zone where nothing else existed except the music. The judges, who had been so bored and dismissive just minutes ago, were now frozen in their seats. The silver-haired judge, the one who had been tapping his pen impatiently, had now put his pen down completely. He was leaning so far forward on the table that he was almost falling out of his chair. He had taken off his glasses and was rubbing his eyes, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He kept looking from the boy's hands to his face, trying to find the trick. He was a professional. He knew how hard the piano was. He knew that playing at this speed required muscles and coordination that a 6-year-old simply shouldn't have developed yet. But there was no trick. The boy was doing it live and in real time, right in front of his eyes. Next to him, the female judge had stopped looking at her papers entirely. Her mouth was open slightly. She was a woman who had seen thousands of musicians, from pop stars to classical virtuosos. She knew talent when she saw it. But this was something else. This was the kind of talent that comes along once in a lifetime. She felt a shiver go down her spine. The music wasn't just technically perfect. It was filled with emotion. It was angry in some parts and sad in others. It was profound. How could a 6-year-old, a child who probably worried about losing his toys or scraped knees, understand such deep, complicated emotions? It was a mystery, a beautiful, confusing mystery. She found herself holding her breath, afraid that if she breathed too loudly, might break the spell. In the audience, the mood had shifted completely. The room was dead silent. You couldn't hear a single cough, a whisper, or the rustle of a sweet wrapper. Hundreds of people were staring at the stage, completely captivated. The man in the 5th row, who had been checking his watch earlier, was now sitting on the edge of his seat. His eyes were wide. He had forgotten all about his coffee and his schedule. He was witnessing something that he knew he would tell his grandchildren about one day. The sheer talent radiating from the stage was undeniable. It was like a magnetic force that pulled everyone in. The music continued to build. It started to get faster. The boy's hands were moving so fast now that they were almost a blur. It looked like a magic trick. The sound was a torrent of notes, a waterfall of music that poured over the audience. It was incredibly difficult to play. One mistake, one slip of the finger, and the whole flow would be ruined. The tension in the room was unbearable. People were gripping the armrests of their chairs. They were witnessing a high-wire act without a net. If he messed up now, it would be devastating, not just for him, but for everyone watching, because they all wanted him to succeed. They were no longer judging him. They were rooting for him. They were invested. Then came the hardest part of the piece. The music suddenly changed. The fast, flowing melody stopped, and a loud, aggressive section began. This required power. It required hitting the keys with force. The boy sat up straighter. He raised his hands high and brought them down with a crash. The sound was like a thunderclap. He was attacking the piano now. The instrument was groaning under the assault. The sound was so loud that it vibrated in the chests of the people sitting in the front row. They could feel the music as much as they could hear it. Watching him use such force was strange because he looked so fragile. His arms were thin and weak-looking. His wrists were tiny. But the sound he produced was massive. It was as if he was channeling the strength of a giant. He would stomp on the pedals with his heels, his legs swinging back and forth in the air because he couldn't reach the floor. It looked awkward, but the sound it produced was perfect. He had learned to use his whole body to play. He leaned into the piano, putting his shoulder into the notes, rocking back and forth with the rhythm. He was physically fighting the instrument to get the sound he wanted, and he was winning. The boy's face was flushed red now. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead and onto his nose, but he didn't wipe it away. He didn't dare stop. His eyes were burning with focus. He was in the middle of a battle. The notes were coming at him fast, and he was catching them one by one, slapping them into submission. It was an incredible display of athleticism and artistry combined. People in the crowd looked at each other with wide eyes, shaking their heads in disbelief. They were seeing the impossible happen right in front of them. Backstage, in the shadows of the wings, the boy's parents were standing with their hands over their mouths. The mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had seen him practice every day. She knew how good he was. But seeing him here, on this stage, holding the attention of thousands of people, was overwhelming. She wasn't just a proud mom anymore. She was the mother of a prodigy, and the weight of that realization was heavy. The father was squeezing his wife's shoulder so hard his knuckles were white. He was terrified that the boy would make a mistake. But at the same time, he was filled with a fierce, burning pride. He knew what people had thought when they saw his son. He knew they had underestimated him. And now, his son was proving them all wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The silver-haired, Juge, was now writing furiously on his paper. But he wasn't writing criticisms. He was writing down the time, the name of the piece, and stars. Lots of stars. He realized that he would remember this audition for the rest of his career. He had been judging these competitions for 20 years, and he had never seen anything like this. He looked over at the other judges and saw that they were just as mesmerized. They shared a look that said, "Did you just see that?" It was a moment of shared wonder among people who were usually hard to impress. The boy showed no signs of tiring. Even though the piece was long and physically exhausting, his fingers seemed to have a mind of their own. They knew exactly where to go. The complexity of the music was increasing. It was full of discordant clashes and strange harmonies that shouldn't work but did. It was sophisticated. It was genius. It was the kind of music that made you think about life and love and loss. The audience was no longer just watching a show. They were on a journey. The boy was leading them through a landscape of sound, taking them up high peaks and down into deep valleys, every time he finished a difficult phrase. The crowd wanted to cheer, but they held back. They didn't want to break the concentration. They knew he was in a delicate state of focus. If they interrupted him, the magic might shatter. So, they suffered in silence, letting the applause build up inside them like water behind a dam. The anticipation in the room was reaching a boiling point. Everyone knew the end was coming. The music was heading toward a climax. It was getting faster, louder, and more intense. The boy's hands were flying across the keyboard, moving so fast they looked like little birds fluttering. He hit a series of chords that were so fast they sounded like a drum roll. The sound was filling every inch of the auditorium. It bounced off the walls and the ceiling. It shook the floor. The boy was swaying violently now, his head bobbing to the rhythm. He was lost in the storm of his own making. He wasn't thinking about the judges or the audience or the competition anymore. He was just playing. He was expressing himself in the only language he truly understood. And for those few minutes, he was the most powerful person in the world. He had captured everyone's heart, and he wasn't about to let go. The room was electrified, buzzing with an energy that was almost visible. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with awe, admiration, and pure shock. No one could look away. The little boy in the big suit was showing the world that size doesn't matter, that talent doesn't care about age, and that sometimes the most incredible things come from the smallest packages. The music that was filling the auditorium now was not just sound. It was a living, breathing thing. It had started as a shock, but now it was becoming a journey. The boy wasn't just playing a song. He was taking the entire room on an adventure. The melody had shifted from the loud, thunderous opening to something softer, more intricate, and incredibly sad. It was a melody that tugged at the heartstrings, a slow, weeping sound that made you think of lost things and rainy days. Watching him play. This softer section was even more amazing than watching him play the fast parts. To play quietly on a piano is actually harder than playing loudly. You have to have total control. If you hit the key too hard, the note sounds harsh. If you hit it too softly, it doesn't sound at all. The boy's touch was gentle, like a butterfly landing on a flower. He was coaxing the sound out of the instrument, petting the keys rather than striking them. His face had softened too. The fierce concentration was still there, but his eyes looked far away. He was seeing something in his mind that nobody else could see. The audience was hypnotized. There were thousands of people in that hall, but you couldn't hear a single breath. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath along with the boy. The air felt charged, like the heavy, still feeling you get right before a lightning strike. People were leaning forward in their seats, their mouths slightly open, their eyes glued to the stage. No one was checking their phones. No one was whispering to their neighbor. No one was thinking about dinner or work or what they had to do tomorrow. Every single person in that room was trapped in the moment, captivated by the small boy in the oversized suit. Even the judges had completely let their guard down. The harsh judge, the one who had been tapping his pen and looking bored, was now sitting with his chin resting on his hands. He had a look of pure wonder on his face, like a child watching a magic trick that he couldn't figure out. He forgot he was supposed to be judging. He forgot he was supposed to be looking for flaws. There were no flaws to find. He was just listening, letting the music wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't a critic. He was just a fan, sitting in the presence of greatness. The boy's hands moved up the keyboard, climbing higher and higher. The notes became sharper, more piercing. The tension in the music started to build again, like a roller coaster slowly clicking its way up the highest hill. You knew something big was coming. The boy's body language changed again. He stopped leaning forward and pulled his shoulders back. He seemed to grow right there on the bench. The small, fragile child was gone, replaced by a conductor of immense power. He was driving the music now, pushing it harder and faster. The rhythm became faster. It was a driving, pulsing beat that made your heart race along with it. The boy's left hand was jumping down low, playing a heavy, marching rhythm, while his right hand was flying over the high keys in a dizzying storm of notes. It was incredibly complicated. His fingers had to move in completely different directions at the same time. It was like patting your head and rubbing your stomach, but 1,000 times faster and with much more serious consequences if you messed up. But he didn't mess up. Not even once. It was as if his hands had a brain of their own. They moved with a confidence that was terrifying to watch. He didn't hesitate. He didn't search for the notes. He knew exactly where they were. He had practiced this piece thousands of times in the early morning before school and late at night when other kids were asleep. All that lonely. Hard work was pouring out of him right now in a glorious flood of sound. A bead of sweat rolled down the boy's temple and dripped onto the piano keys. Under the bright hot lights, he was working hard. You could see his small muscles flexing in his arms. You could see him lifting his wrists high to get the force he needed. He was physically fighting to control this giant machine, and he was winning. The effort was immense, but he never looked tired. He looked energized. He looked alive. He was glowing with the sheer joy of playing. For him, This wasn't work. This was where he was meant to be. This was his language, and he was finally shouting it to the world in the back of the room. A teenager who had been planning to go to the bathroom 10 minutes ago was still standing in the aisle. He had forgotten to move. He was frozen, staring at the stage. He had been playing the guitar for 5 years and thought he was pretty good. But listening to the 6-year-old, he realized he knew nothing about music. The talent on stage was intimidating. It was humbling. It made you feel small, but in a good way. It made you realize that there is magic in the world, things that can't be explained by practice alone. There was a spark in this boy that you couldn't teach. You either had it or you didn't, and this boy had it in buckets. The music was getting louder now. The soft, sad part was gone. The boy was attacking the keys again. He was hitting the chords so hard that the piano seemed to shudder. The sound was filling every corner of the hall. It was bouncing off the ceiling and the walls. It was a wall of sound that was so big it felt like it was going to lift the roof off the building. The complexity of the notes was mind-boggling. He was running up and down the scales, skipping notes, jumping octaves, doing things with his hands that seemed physically impossible for someone with such small fingers. The audience was on the edge of a collective, nervous breakdown. It was like watching a tightrope walker who starts running and doing backflips on the wire. Every time he finished a difficult run of notes, the crowd wanted to cheer, but they were too scared to break the spell. They were terrified that if they made a sound, he might lose his focus and fall. They were protecting him, holding the silence for him like a shield. The boy's face was glistening with sweat now. His hair was starting to dampen and stick to his forehead, but he didn't care. He wasn't aware of the audience anymore. He wasn't aware of the judges, the cameras, or the lights. The world had shrunk down to the 98 keys in front of him. He was inside the music. He was swimming in it. He was fighting a dragon with 1,000 notes, and he was winning. The female judge, the one who was so stern earlier, had tears in her eyes. She wasn't crying because she was sad, and she wasn't crying because it was cute. She was crying because it was beautiful. She was a musician, and she knew the math behind the music. She knew the odds of hitting every note perfectly at that speed. She knew that what he was doing was defying the laws of nature. Watching him was like watching a bird fly for the first time. You knew it should be impossible. But there it was, happening right in front of you. The tempo of the music was becoming frantic now. It was racing toward the finish line. The boy's hands were a blur. You couldn't even see his fingers moving anymore. It just looked like a ghost was hovering over the keyboard, pressing the keys. The sound was a torrent, a waterfall of music that crashed over the audience. It was thrilling. It was scary. It was magnificent. The boy was swaying so hard that he looked like he might fall off the bench, but he was perfectly balanced. He was in total control of the chaos. Every person in that room felt their heart beating in time with the music. Thump thump. The adrenaline was pumping through everyone. It felt like the climax of a movie, but this was real life. There was no editing, no retakes, no auto-tune. This was a raw, unfiltered display of human potential. It was a reminder that sometimes the most incredible things come from the most unexpected places. The boy slammed his foot down on the pedal one last time, holding it down to let the sound sustain. He was building up to the final moments. The tension in the room was almost painful. Everyone was leaning so far forward they were practically falling out of their seats. The silence was no longer empty. It was vibrating with anticipation. The judges had stopped writing completely. The audience had stopped breathing. The boy was poised over the keys, his small hands raised like claws, ready to strike the final blow. The energy in the room was a physical thing, a heavy pressure that pushed down on everyone. He had them. He had all of them. In that moment, the 6-year-old boy was the king of the world, and the piano was his throne. The music was reaching its peak, swelling like a wave about to break. The audience knew it was coming. The judges knew it was coming. And the boy, with his eyes closed and his heart full, knew it was coming too. He was ready to deliver the final punch.